Hey, this is Boaz. Thanks for showing up. Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Hi, welcome to the Fools and Sages podcast, where we talk about tools for making sense and meaning in turbulent times. I'm Boaz. I've been a founder and executive in renewable energy businesses for about 25 years, and now I work with organizations on the quality of their thinking and collaboration.
And I'm Brian. I'm a teacher, a builder, an artist, a therapist, a backyard philosopher.
Cool. So in today's episode, I thought we'd explore an idea a little more that's come up in a few of the conversations we've already had on the Fools and Sages podcast, which is the idea of yin will and yang will. And I think a way that this can be contextualized is, I think as folks become more conscious, they commonly experience a tension between allowing things to emerge versus exerting their will. And, there's a lot of kind of motivational speakers and business leaders and folks like that who really emphasize the make things happen. You can do anything you set your mind to, and you can if you're disciplined, you can execute. And on the flip side, there are also people who go, I would say, too far in the other direction, almost into spiritual bypass world of, nothing really can be done through the exertion of will. Everything is emergence. So I'm just going to hang back and let things unfold, sometimes to their detriment.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think a secondary idea here that we might get into, we'll see where it goes, is the merits of discipline and also the limitations of discipline. I thought those ideas might go together a little bit.
Mm-hmm. No, there's a lot there. And it is something that we've talked about a bunch before in from other angles. So usually when I'm addressing the idea of yin will and yang will, I address it from a standpoint of Chinese medicine, which is where I encountered the idea. And just to reprise that, I think we might have talked about that in other episodes, but to reprise that, the idea is that that there's both a yin and a yang will, with the idea being that yang is what's obvious and clear, and yin is what's hidden. And so that the way that I've described this before is if life was like a sailing in a boat, and you're sailing into the wind, you might be tacking to the northwest, you might be tacking to the northeast, you might go back and forth from those, but really you were heading north the whole time. And our yang will, the will that we see, the obvious will, I'm going to do this, is the one that's, the direction that the boat is pointed. But the yin will is the direction that we're actually headed if we were looking at that course zigzagging across the map. You'd see that we were actually traveling in a direction that we were never pointed in. right?
And maybe never fully aware of.
And maybe never fully aware of. And that's that idea of yin or hidden will. But I think that there's a number of other interesting things. So that's the way I usually describe that. And, we map this onto our lives in a straightforward way. Well, there I was going to school for this, and all of a sudden I decided I was going to drop out and do one of these. And everybody in our life goes, "What? What are you doing?" And I like to say that in those moments, sometimes people get hit by the boom when you're coming about, and they end up in the water, and you go sailing off in another direction, right? and But in light of some of the other conversations that we've had, there are there's some interesting things in the way you presented the question. For example, you said that uh, motivational speakers, uh, there's an endless supply of them that are always telling us we can do it. And they're speaking to the yang will, the clear one, right? Well, if we take this idea and we map it on to the conversation that we had about the semantic world, there's dimensions to that, of course, that we didn't touch. And the element about this that we maybe could explore more is how we look to the semantic world to handle all of our anxiety about the future and about life and about death, right? The semantic world is where we go to solve the problem of the future.
So
So
we can conceptualize it.
we conceptualize it so we can handle it and manipulate it and hopefully predict it, because unpredictability is a real problem for that semantic world brain that we have. But if we remember that when we talked about the semantic world, we know that that was a sort of a mapping of the actual world, and that only half of our brain uses that linguistic mapping that we use to build logic out of. Although we don't have to build logic out of it, I should point out, we can build poetry out of it. We can make all sorts of illusions, but typically, one of the products most useful in predicting and controlling the future is predictive logic, right? So we should point out that that brain is also the cultural brain. It's the world that was informed by our being developed growing up, our apparatus harmonizing with the environment that we grew up in with our foot nailed down, if you recall from past episodes. So that world is an inaccurate map insofar as it's a model to make reality more handleable. Um, so there's an entire aspect that simplified lower resolution model just can't map. I think we referred to that last time. The fancy philosopher word for that is qualia, right? An experience of that we have as an embodied human that there's no way we can capture and translate to language, right? It is the unspeakable, right? All the aspects of the Tao which cannot be spoken must live in that place. So if we realize, there's there's a thing that goes on in the Western world that was beautifully stated by Descartes when he said, "I think, therefore I am." And we've taken from that the thinking self is the extent of the self. Even though we had this guy Sigmund Freud come along later and he discovered the unconscious, this idea of an aspect of ourselves that's not out in the bright light of clear logical consciousness is not that new. Okay. um but just like those motivational speakers tell us, you get motivated, you can do it, your young will do it all, is also like saying your semantic world brain will do it all. And that is what our cultural brain tells us. That's the message of our culture. We've got this handled. You're going to have contentment. You're going to have fulfillment. Just follow the cultural message. And the problem is that whole other half of the brain, which maps all the rest of reality that lives outside of our semantic world. And the real world and the real higher dimensions of the world live outside of that semantic world. So, because we as beings extend beyond our semantic world, believe it or not, and that's what I always complain about Descartes. The I that thinks is not the equal and total of the I that is. There are other dimensions of the I. Uh, Freud discovered the unconscious, and then Jung discovered the collective unconscious. And there's an idea that we're looking through the back side of things, like looking in the back of the television set. For those of us that remember a television set that had a back that you could look into, right? And so if the I that Descartes proposed was the full extent of the I that is, then presumably our lives would be completely logical. We'd chart a straight course to fulfillment, happiness, contentment. There would be nothing for Sigmund Freud to discover. There would be nothing for Jung to discover. There would be nothing going on with shamanism for its, time back to the dawn of time. And there are people that believe this, right? But we're starting to see things differently. We're starting to understand that there's more to us in a more modern sense. That's part of this understanding some of the archaic adjustments, or rather archaic worldviews that now we're kind of refusing with. Hopefully, this is what McKenna hoped for.
Wilbur. Yeah.
But yeah, and Wilbur. But so there's a lot going on there, and this is an element of understanding ourselves and realizing that there's maybe more than the logical element of our awareness implies, or that our culture implies to us.
So, if I could maybe distill something from that, I think another way of saying what you're getting at is that yin will corresponds to the real universe, and yang will corresponds to the semantic universe to some extent.
Yeah, or the yin will corresponds to the entire dark room, and the yang will is the part we can see in the flashlight of our awareness.
Yeah,
But there's something about this yin will that pulls us. We're not just randomly shining that flashlight around. There is something that pulls us, and that's this idea of destiny.
I thought we might get to destiny.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
okay, let's start there then.
Uh-huh.
Um, we could go in a couple of directions, but
Yeah.
With destiny, I think what you're saying is that yin will has a vector. Yang will might have a variety of vectors which are contained by, consciously or unconsciously, and perhaps commanded by, consciously or unconsciously, yin will. So maybe let's talk about destiny, but also talk about whether it's possible for the choices that we make via yang will to subvert our yin will.
Yeah, that's an old question, isn't it? And should it? Should we? I mean, the way that I would see it is that, well, we get right away into, I suppose, a certain metaphysical or cosmological presuppositions. if everything is just ping pong balls bouncing into each other, that is the universe is fundamentally materialistic, then we sort of have nowhere to go with with a teleological viewpoint. But if that would be to say, if evolution, for example, was pure chance, pure selection of adaptation, and was just picking out completely the fittest, uh, then well, I've heard an argument that I think Ken Wilber refers to, saying that evolution would take about 3 times longer then. It's a mathematical argument that's over my head. But the other argument, the explanation for why it's so short comparatively, is this idea that order emerges. This, which is an old idea when we talk about the cosmos. Cosmos in Greek means order. So this idea, or when we talk about in Chinese the Hunyuan Qi, that says that there is this qi, this energy that organizes the universe, and that's why all the flowers open at the right time, and that's why the seeds all ripen at the right time, and why the birds all know when to chirp in the morning. The energy that sews everything together implies that there is an order. So if you suppose, as I said a few episodes ago, that the universe is universing by youing you, then this idea of destiny says that there is this I almost think of it as a soul wind. There is an intention behind the universe that you fulfill your individuation, that you become who you truly are, that the universe intended something by you. You're not just a ping pong ball, and that you can unfold these dimensions with the help of the universe, because that's what the universe wants to happen. That's why it puts you there. And that is your destiny. So, but there's this crazy idea of free will that gets tangled in there. And that's why I say it's like a soul wind, that you can try to sail against the wind, you can sail with the wind. When I had the experience of seeing my life and looking back and seeing my zigzag path and understanding that there was an intelligence that was guiding that yin will, my intent was not to subvert it. My intent was to be a co-conspirator with it, to be a partner to heaven and earth, is the way the Taoists might say. To run wing and wing with the soul wind rather than to try to tack against it. So I mean, that tangles in with your idea of destiny. And my feeling is that if this just lives in that semantic world, then these are just words. But in some of the deeper experiences that can be had, that we look to certain other modes of consciousness to, to inform ourselves in, then we might find that we come up with a deeper sense of who we are and what it means to be who we are. And I think that if we get that on the right circuits, we understand it as, and this is kind of a Crowley thing, that it is our true will, capital T, capital W, to fulfill that thought. Crowley said every man and every woman is a star. That means that you have your course. You are a constellation with all of creation, and unfolding yourself, letting that deeper destiny unfold, is actually being who you are. Because that's what the universe put inside of you. The Buddhists have this beautiful idea called the mind oriented towards enlightenment. And that idea is that there is some higher function. There is a way that I can come into a more complete, more aware relationship with the universe. And that's, the more I attain that, the higher my awareness, the greater the fulfillment, the actual more dimensions of my appreciation of creation, like that. So
So
is that too general?
Well, I think we're going to drill down on a couple things.
Okay.
So maybe one is just to circle back to the idea of a mechanistic universe and ping pong balls crashing into each other. I think there's very much a channel of consciousness present today, maybe embodied to some extent by the new atheist movement, where we had incredibly smart people. I'm thinking of Christopher Hitchens in particular, but he's not alone. Arguing that the ultimate manifestation of human quality is ultimate rationality. You get Sam Harris talking
Yeah,
about this
yeah,
to
uh-huh.
an
Yep.
extent. And then you've got, kind of people arguing against that in ways that could never convince the hyper rationalists,
Of
but
course not.
inform us who are listening.
Yep.
So I wonder, from what you said about the the intent that's implicit in yin will that we cannot be conscious of or fully conscious of, or we become more conscious of. That in itself, I think maybe is an argument against even the possibility that we can encounter the world from a purely rational standpoint. But what
Right.
else would you
Right.
say about that? What would your answer to the new atheists be?
Um, well, I think that that's right. Um, where do you start? Um, yeah, I mean, maybe go back to the first part of that. Uh, do that first part again and let's pick it up there first. And that
Um,
that was
so
drilling down on.
drilling down on what you said about destiny, and in particular the idea that there's a yin will that um, we probably can't ever be fully conscious of,
Okay,
but
that's where I wanted to stop you
okay,
because I wanted to draw a distinction between being fully conscious and being engaged in the semantic world.
okay,
I don't they're not co-equal, right? There's lots of things that we can be conscious of that we don't play through the semantic world, right? So rational logical understanding only lives in the semantic world, but consciousness will map outside of that. And that's the really interesting part of that. Yeah.
just a really simple example, a smell that goes straight to the reptile brain, right, and takes
Right.
us back to some memory
Right.
is not
Or
necessarily being
or a
processed.
religious experience. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's interesting because there's a lot that comes in with this. I'm trying to think, there are times I've had this conversation with people about, okay, well, we might have referenced this before. The paper that I wrote, the only one worth referencing in my collegiate experience, there were two, a pair. First part was the limitations of logic, which is sort of like into the face of rational being is the highest level of being, right? And the second one was uh, meta logic or after logic, past logic, another avenue for apprehension. And I looked for, with the ambiguity of that apprehension, because I looked at William James and the varieties of religious experience. And the fascinating thing is not the variety, really. The fascinating thing is the unity of experience, right? If we translate it, metaphysically. So, so I don't think that there is a rational experience or a rational argument that you can make for out of the box uh, thinking, because that thinking's in the box. And this is an argument actually that's pretty old. Like it's, I would see it as fundamental between the differences between Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle's very methodological, and he wants to explain everything. And he is of that school, that reason. Like, I always think of Aristotle with a piece of his called De Categoria, which apparently came from when he was very young. And he says there are 10 ways in which a thing is said to be. And then he speaks as if those are the ways the things are, as if our semantic world was exactly co-equal to the other world. But Plato's not going to fall for that for a minute, right? And Plato, read the Symposium where he talks about love. And there are places where he retreats into the mysteries. And these were the Eleusinian mysteries. And he clearly has a map that goes beyond the purely semantic world. He talks about moments when he's listening to his daimon, right? And that is another interesting reference. When I was in school, there was a very popular book called The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes. And his argument was that the ancients heard the right brain speaking in their head to their left brain as if it was a distinct entity, aka the gods. And that it was over time and development that we actually kind of got the breakdown of that bicameral two-piece brain, which it happens in the form of the corpus callosum, right? This connection. And there are other connections in the deeper brain too, but the one that gets all the press is the corpus callosum. And what's interesting about the corpus callosum is that it only shows up after about 2 years old. And some of these capacities to do with the differentiation of the bicameral aspects that we still have don't settle in until, adolescence, 10, 12, 8, 10, 12, somewhere in that chapter. And so clearly we have apparatus that extends beyond the semantic world. And ancient traditions also show us the portals to that. And that, of course, swings open the big door to all the shamanic practices. And as well as, a whole series of different meditative practices, a different, physiological practices like fasting for a vision, as opposed to a yogic methodology or a plant medicine, or so there's a lot of ways traditionally that we've said maybe there's a way we can peek behind the curtain. But there's a I would make a good argument that the logic, if you will, that operates in that other side is not the same as over here. And so there's some ropes to be learned in that transition. Yeah.
I lost you there for a sec. The other side, as opposed to here. When you said other side, I thought you were talking about one side of the brain versus the other. But what did you mean by the other
Well,
side?
I'm talking about the shamanic world
Okay.
also. And there's a whole interesting topic that we've touched on that has to do with the brain function and the fact that I think we talked about musicality and musicality using the brain in a different way than the purely spoken word or logical argument does. And that many of these traditions, uh, they are sung. They're not just spoken. Uh, or they might be chanted in a rhythmic way that I'm sure engages that same other brain function, so that we're using a different brain function in those states than we might be. This is where the interesting different, really understanding yogas and the effect of bhakti yoga, the effect of extreme devotion uh, on brain function. There's a lot of unmapped territory there. But again, we come back to viewing the world with passion or without passion. Without passion to see the source of things, with passion to see the manifest forms, which we've spoken about before. And that does seem to be how our brains are integrating, how our brain spheres are integrating. And some of these traditions indicate that there are ways we can tune the system a little differently and get back a lot of different kind of data.
Okay, so so we've cracked the door open a couple of times on shamanism in this episode, and I think shamanism is a great lens for looking at this question of yin will and yang will. And in another episode, we talked a little bit about a shaman adding energy to a thought package and sending it somewhere,
Uh-huh.
which sounds to me like a manifestation of yang will. And we've also talked about the shaman being a channel for something akin to universal love or the the
Yeah.
the potential for healing, and that
Yeah.
being more of a yin manifestation.
Yeah.
What
I wouldn't agree that that's a yang will,
Okay,
the shamans.
go for
I
it.
would say that the shaman's will is has to use both brains, both halves of the brain to be able to operate. And that his is actually a will that's refined in a way that because of the training that he goes through, that's different than he started. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
How would you characterize the difference in will?
Well, do you remember when I told you, I think in an earlier episode, I mentioned when I sort of got how I could put my will into the song that I was singing. And again, through the not just the medicine, but the fact that the way the songs work and all the pieces working together, uh, my brain works in a different way than when I say, "Okay, I'm going to the store. What do you need?" "Where are my car keys?" Or, you know, there's that very narrow kind of turning on to things, and then, like the shamanic explanation might be, well, I'm communicating and calling helpers, and um, and I'm calling the medicine, and the medicine is revealing things to me. So for example, uh, this is a yin and yang of it. The shaman, I would argue, doesn't just go into a situation and start yanging around. I would argue that, I've mentioned before that the way a shaman works is kind of like he asks and the golf club that he needs jumps out of the bag, as opposed to him having to pick the bag, or pick the club rather. Picking the club the normal way would be engaging yang will,
Right,
and that doesn't work very well, it turns out.
right.
It's just about the same as doing a ceremony and using a cassette recorder to play a song. You're just the cassette recorder in this case, right? There's no real, maybe it saves breath, right? It uses batteries instead, but it's really no fundamental difference. On the other hand, if you go through the process, the shamanic process of calling before you begin an ikaro, the ikaro that comes forward to channel the yang aspects, the conscious aspects of your will, I don't know who chose that. I don't know whether it's on my device or in the shamanic cloud. Okay. But they're in such close communication that it works the same way either way.
Mhm.
So I want to put myself as a vessel for the forces of creation, the forces that want light, the forces that want the positive aspects of things by universal standards, not by my personal standards. And that's the interpretation that, yeah, the universe wants life to emerge. Maybe that sounds too telealistic or too teleological for people, but based on my experience, it's not at all. Life emerges, order emerges. The universe conserves complexity. There's something going on here, and it's fundamental, and you're better off being in harmony with it. Those are the assumptions, I guess. And so the shaman isn't just out there, he's the dude. The shaman is, like the Taoists would say, a partner to heaven and earth. He wants to be there as an impersonal aspect of the healing force of nature, of the elements of the universe that want the flowers to bloom and want the birds to sing and want the dawn to come and want your children to grow up into happy humans and want the, all of that life is striving through, the grass growing through the concrete, right?
So is healing itself part of the order, and um, dis dysregulation, dysfunction, whatever the opposite of healing is, not the order?
Well, I think both.
Yeah.
I think and that's where karma comes in, maybe, and that destiny,
Mhm.
because there is again, the brain that inhabits the semantic world fears death, and the brain that knows that we're connected to everything because the universe universed us doesn't have that kind of anxiety. Part of the purpose of the semantic world is to handle that anxiety, right? But but the shaman or the Zen master that is attained loses the charge around death because it's just um, so because there are times when it's appropriate, because there is a time when the corn is ripe and the fruit falls from the trees. Isn't there a great song about that? Turn, turn, turn. To everything there is a season. So
Yeah.
sometimes the season is yin, and sometimes the season is decay so that regrowth can happen. But
Yeah,
there's
I'm
also
doing that.
times when it's not right. There's also times when we can intervene and fix things. And then we should, if we can, without doing it, if as long as we're not doing some greater injustice thereby.
I'm doing that binary thing where I'm categorizing on one plane, and there's more than one plane in play here. So both healing and dysfunction are part of order, and in certain moments, um, healing manages to manifest, and that's a greater order, and maybe one with greater peace and contentment for the person experiencing that healing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know where we end up here again is at onion peelings, right? What level are we
Universe is
identifying at?
the universe is a joke of the general at the expense of the particular?
Right.
Yeah.
And so when we identify with the particular, then we weep,
Mhm.
and then we realize that nature is unkind and treats us like sacrificial straw dogs, and therefore the sage is unkind and treats things and people like sacrificial straw dogs because he knows that the Tao is the source of everything and that nothing can be lost. You can't flush a ping pong ball, as I've said before, and so that there isn't that anxiety because the fused brain understands its place in the universe, and the split brain doesn't understand its place in the universe. So, and that's why we want that tuning: view life with passion, view life without passion, right? And and that's where onion peelings ends up. Uh, Onion peelings were referring to a chapter in a book again by Aleister Crowley, which at one point I think he said he thought was his greatest work or the best statement of his philosophy or something, words to that effect. And it's another one of these things like Finnegan's Wake. You're going to maybe take a few runs at this before you get where it's really going. But
Do
the
you remember it well enough to
yeah, yeah.
start it off here?
Yeah, the idea of the onion peelings, I'll try to quote it correctly, is that the universe is the joke of the general at the expense of the particular. Thus, quoth frater perderabo, brother, I will endure, in Latin, frater perderabo, and laughed. Because the universe is a joke of the general at the expense of the particular. Others, disciples next to him, seeing the universal sorrow, wept. Other disciples next laughed. Other disciples next wept. Next, other disciples laughed. Next, other disciples wept. Finally came those that wept because they could not understand the joke, and those that laughed because they didn't want to be thought to not understand the joke, or words to that effect. But though while Frater Perturabo laughed outwardly, within himself he wept, but actually within himself he neither wept nor laughed, nor did he mean what he'd said.
Right.
So,
I think that
and
was
made onion peelings.
yeah.
Yeah. And that is exactly switching between the universal joke and the universal sorrow by identifying to one, or identifying by identifying life with passion, as Lao Tzu said, or without passion. And having this is a similar idea that was said in the old days, that humans are creatures dangling between the beasts and the gods. And that's that idea that when we are rooted in the beasts, we're, I've mentioned this before, as being rooted in the will to receive. We're like the baby at birth, like the shark, it's just a mouth and it just wants things to go in. And then we see people that even though they grow up and they're adults and they have, they're not babies anymore, they really have only altered a little the focus of that will to receive. Now it's Lambos and Rollies and the things that are rewarded within the semantic world. Because once we've decided to enter the semantic world what's the word, to assuage the concern of all that uh, uh, unknown, uncontrollable, unpredictable life, um, we come to build a self that exists within that semantic world, because that's our connection to other humans. We live through that semantic world. So we look at a person and they say, okay, that guy looks like a very ordinary person. And they say, oh, but that person is very successful because he's XYZ. Fill in your semantic qualifier. And now people will be, well, he's the king of Sweden, or he's the owner of this and that, and these are all like one of my teachers would say, oh, these are like we hang them on us. Oh, I am that, right? Well, that's all going to be semantic world stuff. It's not, and so none of those things are going to scratch itches that don't live in the semantic world. They're not going to scratch itches that are in the real world in which we exist, right? And that's that part of this split condition of trying to get one by pursuing the other, like Carlin's image of trying to get fulfillment with stuff being like taping sandwiches all over your body. If you remember that image.
Yeah. I wasn't expecting to go here in this topic, but what you just said made me think about identity and the relationship that or the role that identity is playing in the general conversation, I would say, in American society or Western society in general. And I think there are aspects of identity that are easy to qualify as the will to receive kind of labels. And then I have to admit that with October 7th, I experienced my identity as a Jew and an Israeli in a much deeper way than I would have expected to. And I've experienced it powerfully in ceremonies as well.
Uh-huh.
But in this case, there was a sense of those are my people that was bubbling up from a deep place inside me I didn't know existed. That I had an inkling existed because when I went to Dachau, I felt that too, that
Okay.
these are my people. And since then, I've been asking myself a lot, what does Judaism actually mean to me, and what does being Israeli actually mean to me? And my answer to that will have some element of Judaism manifesting in my life differently. It already has. I'm in a very rudimentary way now keeping the Sabbath, at least lighting candles on Friday night, and um, I envision kind of adding more ceremonies that connect me to however many thousand years of lineage that I come from that I've mostly been ignoring
Uh-huh.
this time
Right.
around. And so
Right.
I'm curious how you think about identity relative to, there's like some obvious garbage that's just a trap to get sucked into.
Mm-hmm.
There's also stuff that turns out
It's pretty important.
is a source of connection, right? And
Uh-huh.
and meaning.
Well, famous yogi, Ramana Maharishi, said that you could be enlightened if you kept asking yourself the question, "Who am I?" And that if you really gave yourself to that question, uh, that you would ultimately become enlightened. And so that's a clue that this is a deep topic. The mystery of identity, the mystery of selfhood, understanding what we mean when we say I. That goes back to my issue with Descartes. So glibly saying je, right? so,
Mhm.
so that unfolding that, what's the know thyself was on Plato's Academy, right? So this idea, for example, that young people would have certain ideas about their identities leads me to believe that maybe as a culture, we don't have a deep enough respect for the mystery of identity. And part of that is how do I how do I how do I feel about me being me? What does it mean to me to be me? Because this is the other side of the question is what does the universe mean when it use you, right? Uh, so it's logical that what Ramana Maharishi says that if the universe was viewing you and you keep asking, "Who am I?" You're going to meet at some point. Okay, so and yet at the same time, identity. I have a unique perspective on this. Not unique, completely unique, but unique from most people in that because of my birth conditions, I was given to people who I was told will be your people, uh, but I knew inside my bones somehow that these were not my people. But there is, but that category, my people, has no set answer. It reminds me of Ken Wilber's book, No Boundaries, where he says, he starts with a Chinese saying, "Sure, sure, wu ai." A sure is an entityness, a thing, an event, a particularity. Between one sure and another sure, wu I, no boundary. And so we put in boundaries for sense making. So, boundaries used to be uh, me, my family, my tribe, my region. But then we also moved inside, which we spoke about earlier with these discoveries, where now there's a boundary between my body and my mind, which is not an antique idea, right? And now there's this boundary in my mind between the part where the flashlight of consciousness shines and the part where it doesn't shine, which just goes off in the sfumado, right? The air, the mistiness. And so I don't feel like I'm climbing out on a limb to say that almost nobody knows who they are. Okay. So then that means that we start to choose associations, and we pick those associations based on the moment, you know. And I myself, because of my particular situation and the circumstances around my uh, 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 originations, I don't, I don't have an affinity for having a lot of people making decisions for me in my name. Even people that I know and I have associations with. So members of big groups makes me feel like I'm signing something I don't know what I just bought, right? So I would never join a homeowners association. Right? It's like I don't know what all
Several
what
reasons you would never join a homeowners association.
yeah, that's the takeaway from this.
That,
And
and don't
so
come in here and just start younging around.
yeah, well, and so what it means is that if I'm going to have a participation in this group, that participation has to live in relationship and with respect to my truest identity, and that means that it's going to have to an aspect of me has to be able to manifest within it, or I'm going to start to lose affinity for it, right? And that's why my relationship with political parties is like. You know, it's like we don't have a direct enough relationship for that to show up with me. Uh, my relationship with my government, well, it's clear there's a lot of people with a lot of agendas and tentacles controlling things that my personal interests are pretty low on the list. So I hesitate to want to associate with that as part of an identity. What I think is happening actually through the development of history, and I see this through the Reformation, I see this through the American Revolution, the French Revolution, is actually that we are meant to manifest our diversity and our individuality as opposed to our group membership. So, so that means that we are in a position to take it on and put it off at our choosing. But I think it also means, like, uh, Thoreau and On the Duty of Civil Disobedience goes on to this in depth. It's really great work and was a light at the time because he wouldn't pay a poll tax because he didn't support the war that the poll tax supported. And he said, I'm not going to serve my country as a man of wood or stone. If you're going to get me, you're going to get all of me. And you may not handle all of me. Right. So, and that's what's happening is now where there's a real battle between the collective and the individual. And the experiments of history are this dialogue between the interests of the collective and the interests of the individual. And and that's a part of the reason why I'm in the desert the way that I am, because those restrictions and expectations and participation requirements are minimized when I'm at a distance. I also feel like, as we've spoken about before, for brain dynamic reasons as well as psycho-spiritual reasons, that to be surrounded in a natural environment is superior to being immersed in a man-made one. So that's the other part of that. But there is something about that, and maybe there's some Kali Yuga stuff and the big collective karma that's going on, because that's the other thing we didn't talk about in chapters and transitions. And that is the collective conversation about collective chapters, the zeitgeists, right?
Well, and maybe that ties up to yin will in a particular way too.
It's
So
definitely a component. It's definitely a component.
So yeah, maybe play that out a little bit more.
Well, there is this idea that comes from German philosophy. I don't know who came up with it first, of a Zeitgeist, which means literally time ghost. And it's just that certain times have certain spirits to them. And it is as if there are great mass psychological dynamics at work that move masses of people one way or the other. Um, if you look at history and you look at what was going on before World War I, boy, it sure seemed like the whole world was just scrapping for a brawling, and people just ran to it like it was the ice cream truck, and it was, of course, just this horrific bloodletting. But one of my theories is that, I know it's a little Buddhistic, but it might seem a little dark, and that is that part of what we're here for is to suffer. And I don't mean that in a dark way. I mean that it's part of the component of the experiment of taking on a human body. And so that somehow our spirit is actually informed by our suffering. And that's why I go back to the Bhagavad Gita and Arjuna's conversation with Krishna when he doesn't want to go to war. And Krishna says to him, "Yeah, I know, but you got to go to war." He says, "But I like these people, and I don't want to kill them." And he gives him a little lecture where he says, "Well, the slayer who thinks that he is slain is mistaken, and the one who thinks he has been slain is also mistaken. And that we're doing something, and this is the idea that the whole mind has a place beyond this particular time around, you know, and so there are these great collective chapters of collective karma, of unfolding this learning experience, which shows up sometimes, often, as suffering, but
I've often
that
thought about,
something's achieved by that, you know.
well, a new worldview is achieved by that, right?
Absolutely.
So there's like this confluence of things that happen when, as a species, we kind of, or at least as a Western civilization, I'm not sure how global it is, but when we transition from one worldview to another, and wars are part of it because prevailing ideology or philosophy is changing. Um, and art changes and music changes and
Yep.
everything, and sometimes in shockingly short periods of time, and then consciousness is different. And maybe that's a good note to wrap on, because you said earlier something about integrating the archaic worldview, and we touched on that super briefly,
Uh-huh.
but I think there's something here about worldviews, and how they're included and transcended by their descendants. Um, so, what is it about the archaic worldview that we might be integrating with the rational worldview, and what are we creating from that?
Yeah. You know, w- there's definitely a whole lot there, but I would say that we are collectively unfolding something, um, that, and again, I mean, I guess it gets kind of teleological. I keep coming up with, like, uh, what's her name? Dorothy, in Kansas, right? Because, again, in a short time, she's back in Kansas, but the whole worldview is different. And she's not the same Dorothy. And I suspect Toto is probably pretty different too. And so, in some sense, there's gonna be some flying monkeys, no question about it. And there are, forces to be reckoned with. And I mean, you can experience that shamanically. And at the same time, those it is through it's through that interplay with those forces that we manifest this individuation of our higher selves, right? I get to be a better fighter by fighting with people that are good. And so that in kung fu, that's how I want to fight with good fighters because they're going to up my game. This idea in the Jeremiah Johnson, right, that the natives come to revere their enemy because the greater their enemy, the greater their power that they can attain by competition with that enemy. And so so if there's a purpose to it, I think that it's got something to do with that. I do believe, which is something that I've thought about that's been a part of these conversations, but I haven't brought it up, is this idea that I guess I first came across from Teilhard de Chardin in the of the Omega Point, or McKenna brings it up of the eschaton, the event at the end of history, that there's something unfolding that we're working our way towards, and that we need to purify ourselves through this, gnashing of teeth with materiality before we raise ourselves back to it. There's this Hindu idea that God separates itself out, itself, s- sends out to the very extreme. All the little particles forget that they're really parts of God, and then it all reaches an extreme, and then it all starts coming back. And that it's this process of remembering these higher aspects. This is all over the Sumerian magic, right? When who is it? Ishtar, when she goes to visit her sister Eric Shigal, and she goes through the different gates, she loses. She takes off her crown. She loses one aspect of divinity. She takes off her robe, another aspect, till finally she's down in hell with her sister, the Queen of Hell. And then it's through the power of Enki and the water elemental and the earth elemental that this transformation comes. And then she comes back through those gates, and at each gate she regains a divine attribute. And the Sumerian magician, that's the part that he wants to reprise in himself, so that he takes on and remembers these divine attributes that are the aspects of a completely realized self.
That's really interesting.
It's great stuff.
Juxtaposing that kind of movement of expansion away, and let's call it entropy, or the forgetting, right, the perception of disorder, and then a returning and coalescing. When I tend to think of the evolution of worldviews as kind of a linear trajectory,
Yeah. I think
and
that's one day of Brahma, if I'm not mistaken. The one out and all the way back, and it's like bazillion, dezillion years,
yeah,
300 and some thousand. Yeah.
uh-huh, yeah,
Nietzsche too, the eternal recurrence. Yeah.
mm-hmm. Cool. Well, there's obviously a lot here, and we could keep going,
And
but
we shall.
I think maybe let's pause here, and I'll go back through the notes and collect some of the ideas to bring into subsequent conversations. So yeah, that was awesome. Thank you,
Yeah.
Brian.
And these conversations, they're always interrelated. So for our listeners, if there are questions and things that, we a lot of these things will come back up, or if there's a particular interest in them, we can expand and, drill down a little more on them. So we are interested in hearing from folks and what makes sense, what resonates, what they want to hear more about. So yeah, wonderful.
Cool. Thank you, Brian.
Absolutely. We'll see you next time.